This week's Dark Side of the Ring focused on the story of Hot Stuff, Eddie Gilbert. One of the more underrated minds in the business, not only for his work inside the ring, but outside the ring in the creative department, working as a booker. And he was really good with the way he booked talent back in the day. However, the one thing with Eddie Gilbert was he was clearly a tortured soul, and he sort of became another what if scenario with his sudden death, which we'll talk about in this episode. So, Eddie Gilbert is a guy who, his wrestling was in his blood. His father was in the business in the 70s and the 60s. He was a really big star. And Gilbert was just obsessed with his dad's work and wrestling in general. His brother even said that he would write out the cards, he would write out the shows when he was young. And he actually got into the business as a teenager, as a photographer. One of the people he worked with as a photographer was Jim Cornette. That's right. Him and Jim Cornette were working together taking photos of wrestling events, which is really cool when you think about it. And once he was of age, his father started to train him in the business. He was more of a brawler type wrestler. And years later on, his brother Doug would join in, and both would, enter the business together and work different types of promotions. Something interesting with Eddie Gilbert is he basically was one of the main reasons why hardcore wrestling was a thing. Yeah, I thought it was Atsushi Onita made it popular in Japan, but it was Eddie Gilbert that actually really made it super duper popular. This wasn't mentioned either. It was technically Jerry Lawler who helped inspire it, because him and the Honky Tonk Man had a brawler hardcore style match in the late 70s, early 80s. But Eddie Gilbert was a part of the 1981 concessions brawl, and this was violent. And at this time, it was different compared to everything else that we saw. And with how chaotic it was and how, how violent it was, people were just drawn to it. And who else was in that brawl was Atsushi Onita. Now, Atsushi Onita, if you don't know, he was the founder and the creator of Frontier Martial Arts Wrestling, FMW. They got their own Dark Side of the Ring episode as well. Onita was inspired to do the deathmatch style wrestling and the brawling and the hardcore style because of that brawl Eddie Gilbert was a part of and had the idea for. So there is no hardcore wrestling without Eddie Gilbert popularizing it. And if you haven't watched the FMW Dark Side of the Ring episode, that one's another crazy one. Maybe in the future I might do a video on it. We'll see how things progress. But the thing was, Eddie Gilbert, he did eventually join the WWF in the early 80s. And he was a good worker. They were pairing him with Bob Backlund, who was the WWE champion. They were really high on him. But during his time there, he had a pretty serious car wreck. And they showed the photo of the car wreck. I don't know how he's alive. It wasn't his fault. It was the trucker who, I believe, made a wrong turn. But he hit Eddie Gilbert. And Eddie Gilbert had so many injuries. He had the broken neck, which they talked about. They didn't mention this, but he also had plastic surgery. He would always have a beard just to hide the plastic surgery that was done to get his face properly done. That's why he had the facial hair. And the injury that I think ultimately led to his death later on was in the crash, the steering wheel came right into him onto his chest. And according to Dutch Mantel, Gilbert was told that his heart was like jello because of that collision, and the doctors told him never to wrestle again, which is terrifying that his heart was in that bad state. But because of how fast the steering wheel hit his chest, his heart was damaged. And the crazy part with Eddie Gilbert is not 3 months later, he would be back in the ring wrestling with a broken neck. 3 months later, he's back in the ring with a heart issue, with plastic surgery that he had done on him, and whatever other injuries he had. He was back in there for 3 months. It's no wonder this guy was addicted to painkillers. And when he got back into the ring, he picked that up And you can thank good old Dr. George Sahorian for that. Now, if you don't know, George Sahorian was the doctor who was illegally giving prescriptions for steroids. He was the doctor involved in the steroid trial. And he was the one that kept giving pills to all these wrestlers, illegally. And Eddie Gilbert was one of those guys who got the painkillers and was hooked on it. Something that I want to bring up to you is when I mentioned this on the latest episode of the Ringside Rant podcast. George Sahorian is still a practicing urologist in the state of Pennsylvania to this very day. I don't know why or how that's possible, but yeah, George Sahorian is still a practicing urologist. So he's still out there doing his work after all of his insane drug deals that he's done. And it's just crazy. So now we get into Eddie Gilbert becoming a booker. He had the idea of becoming a booker at the age of 17. Of course, if you don't know, being a booker means you're in charge of the matchmaking, you're a part of the creative, and a lot of the behind the scenes stuff. He was wanting to do that early on, but when he turned to the age of 25 and proved himself into the business, everyone was like, okay, we'll listen to what you got to say. And he had a chance to book Bill Watts' Mid-South promotion. And I gotta say, I remembered watching old tapes back in the day and old videos on the WWE network. I gotta say, he did a really good job booking for the time he was there. I mean, he built up Dr. Death Steve Williams, Sting, The Ultimate Warrior, Rick Steiner, many, many more names. Those got their start in Mid-South, and Eddie Gilbert helped book them. That goes to show how underrated he was. He got these guys over thanks to his booking. Unfortunately, Mid-South was running low on money, and Bill Watts would later sell the company to Jim Crockett, who would later on sell to Ted Turner. And thus began WCW. And something that Dutch Mantel said when Eddie Gilbert was booking is he barely lasted 6 months in any promotion as a booker, which is just, that's not good. If you want to work at a place, you want to stay there for a while. The fact that he worked at a place as a booker and only lasted 6 months, the longest, is just, I don't know what to say with that one there. So now we get into his time in WCW. And let's just say it's not as great as his Mid-South run. And you can thank the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, for that, because Ric Flair would come back to WCW. And one of his stipulations was he wanted a seat on the booking committee. WCW did things differently, where they had a booking committee where there was different type of bookers coming together discussing everything. Booking committees are a little sloppy and can be chaotic at times, but Ric Flair wanted a seat there. Eddie Gilbert was a seat there, and both had to work together. Problem is, Ric Flair didn't like Eddie Gilbert, and he definitely politicked his way around. I mean, what else is new? Politicking backstage is a common thing. I mean, Shawn Michaels did it for the longest time, and John Cena did it as well when remember the name Alex Riley? His career went nowhere thanks to John Cena. That's a different story I would like to tell on the Ringside Rant podcast. But Ric Flair didn't like Eddie Gilbert. And during one of his matches, he booked, it was against Ron Simmons. Gilbert was booked to lose that match thanks to Ric Flair. But Eddie Gilbert didn't like that because they were in Memphis. And he felt like he should have gotten over. Which, I mean, I could see his side of things, but listen, if you're told to lose, you should lose. And, of course, he goes against the plan. And Ric Flair, when he found out, he was not happy about this. And they got into an altercation, and then he went up to creative. He went up to Ted Turner, and he's like, either you get rid of Eddie Gilbert as the booker right now, get him off the committee. The next day, when Eddie Gilbert walks by him in the chair, it's filled by James Cornette, who was reluctant to take the role because Jim Cornette wanted to become the booker, but the problem was he didn't want to lose a friend because he and Eddie Gilbert were close. But of course, Jim Cornette took the role, and Eddie Gilbert was out. And I believe Gilbert quit the company not long afterwards, or got fired. I'm not 100% sure on that. So then we get to him going back out on the indie scene. He decided to have a feud with Eddie. Eddie Gilbert decided to have a feud with Jerry the King Lawler. And he decides to come up with this new idea. It's called the hit and run angle that him and Jerry Lawler were discussing. This was when Eddie Gilbert had the idea of maybe me as the heel, I hit you with a car and I run, sort of like a hit and run. Jerry Lawler was all in on this. Like, it was insane at the time because nothing was ever done of that. So the plan was for Gilbert to hit him with the car, start a feud, and, sky's the limit. But here's another problem that wasn't really mentioned that much. In the world of kayfabe, everyone thought that this was real. Like, everyone thought that this was real. And you had the fans calling the police. You had the fans, reporting that, there was a hit and run. And the police believed it to the point where they showed up to the arena trying to find Gilbert to arrest him. And it didn't happen because Jerry Lawler had to smooth things over. And the only way Eddie Gilbert didn't go to jail was for him to show up and wrestle him and beat him that night. Which is crazy for a guy who just got hit by a car, but Gilbert was willing to go to that length to get a storyline over. This wasn't mentioned, but Jerry Lawler was legit hurt, and I think he had a hip injury. I don't remember what the hip injury was, but he legit went out there to wrestle while his hip was injured and after a car hit. It was just crazy. The documentary went into his personal life because he had a lot of women coming after him, and there were two notable names that he was married to in the business. The first one was Missy Hyatt. Oh my God. I mean, she's another piece of work. There's plenty of stories that don't paint Missy Hyatt in a good light. But Eddie Gilbert and her get married. The marriage lasts around 1.5 years. And while they were about to get married, she was his manager, storyline wise. Unfortunately, the marriage, like I said, didn't last long. Eddie Gilbert, and them divorced. Missy Hyatt claims, and she even says in a shoot interview like a year ago that, and I got the quote right here. She claims that, she wasn't he wasn't being committed to me. Like, wrestling was his life. He had no hobbies outside of wrestling, and that's why the divorce, like the marriage ended. This coming from the same woman who once claimed in her book that months into the marriage, she cheated on Eddie Gilbert with Tom Pritchard in a car after an event. So, yeah, I don't believe her BS one bit. I really don't. And something that wasn't mentioned too was Eddie Gilbert on the side was also cheating on her. So, you combine the two together of two people who were in a marriage cheating on each other. And of course, the marriage is going to fall off. The other woman that Eddie Gilbert was married to was one Alundra Blaze Medusa. Medusa was actually interviewed for this. Missy Hyatt wasn't, which I'm kind of surprised in. But apparently, Medusa, there was definitely a love there. And Eddie Gilbert one day just went up and said, "Hey, you want to get married?" And then she's like, "Sure." And she was accepted to that family, immediately. And it was cool seeing those videos of a young Alundra Blaze and Eddie Gilbert together for the marriage. Unfortunately for everything, the marriage didn't last long. Eddie Gilbert was not the man that she was married, she met. And Eddie Gilbert filed for divorce. And it didn't help that also Eddie Gilbert had the pill issue and he passed out in his food. By the way, this wasn't mentioned either. You want to know how long their marriage lasted? A grand total of 4 months. 4 months into a marriage and you're out. Well, at least it wasn't 72 days like the Kardashian one, the one with Chris Humphries. At least they lasted longer than them. So now Eddie Gilbert is going to ECW. And they straight up say, Todd Gordon, who was the founder of ECW, he straight up said there is no ECW without Eddie Gilbert. He was that influential with his ideas, and he helped book in the early days of ECW to build it to what it was before Paul Heyman took over. There's no Eddie Gilbert without ECW. And to be honest, there kind of really isn't a Paul Heyman without Eddie Gilbert either, especially as a booker and as a promoter, because Eddie Gilbert had brought in Paul Heyman to be his assistant to help him. So that's kind of crazy. I knew about that, and I heard Paul Heyman on multiple interviews call Eddie Gilbert, like he was his mentor. I mean, they didn't get along at the end. I mean, when Eddie Gilbert departed, this was when it was at the 6-month mark, of course, with Dutch Mantel. Like, Eddie Gilbert didn't last more than 6 months. Eddie Gilbert had a habit of showing up late, and he sort of kind of got paranoid working in ECW because Heyman had a deal to work with Jim Crockett at the time, and he believed that they would have fired him if that was the case. So instead of like, oh, you're fired type of thing, like, you can't fire me, I quit. That was his mentality. But a few days pass, and Gilbert regrets, giving his notice, and he wants to stay. But of course, Todd Gordon found someone else to take his spot. And, Eddie's apologizing before the show. He wants to stay. And of course, with him getting a decline, he decides, I want to go out to the crowd to say my goodbye. Fortunately, Paul Heyman didn't like that. He hated it, and he decided to cut his mic off mid-promo. Like, he tore the wires out of the cables to make sure that Eddie Gilbert didn't finish, and that royally angered his brother, who would grab a baseball bat and started smashing everything. Like, he smashed every single thing in that locker room like he was Aaron Judge of the New York Yankees. Like, it ended Heyman's and Gilbert's relationship that day, and they never made up. They never spoke with each other ever again. So Eddie Gilbert, he's on the independent scene again. He gets a chance to work at Puerto Rico. At Puerto Rico is where he gets a chance to book again, because Carlos Colon was hiring him. Unfortunately, he didn't last long in that role. And it's not because of him wanting out, but unfortunately he would pass away suddenly at the age of 33 years old. Apparently, Gilbert was found in his hotel room. He had earphones in his ears. He was listening to music. And it felt like it was like a sudden thing, because he was lying down on the bed. He was getting ready to go to sleep, and he just never woke up. His cause of death was heart failure. There were really two factors that caused the death. According to his brother, he believes that the car accident that damaged his heart was the main reason why it harmed his health and caused his death, which I agree on. I mean, when the steering wheel comes out to your chest, hits you, and your heart turns into jello, that's a problem. Like, that's a problem. But you can't ignore all the drug use that he also did too, with the steroid abuse, with the painkiller abuse. This wasn't mentioned in the documentary, but he also picked up a cocaine habit at the end of his life. But all that combined, and it results to Eddie Gilbert passing away at the age of 33. And it really blows. I mean, like, because he is one of the greatest what ifs. Like, this guy had such a great mind in the business. So many ideas, so many different, characters that he made. He could have been one of the better minds of the business if he got his act together, got sober, stayed into any company that he wanted to work with. But unfortunately, he's just a what if story, which just sucks. I thought this was a really good episode. Gave us a little insights on that hot stuff Eddie Gilbert. Because he doesn't really get talked about as like one of the top people in ECW. He really doesn't. He's one of the more influential and important figures in that promotion. And without him, I don't know if ECW becomes a thing there. And that just sucks. I mean, I'm a little surprised he hasn't been inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. I know he's in the ECW Hall of Fame, but he really should be in the Hall of Fame with how he booked and everything. And I still can't believe, and this goes to show how time flies, even though I wasn't alive when Eddie Gilbert was a thing, but this year, it's been 30 years since Eddie Gilbert passed. It's crazy. It really is. Well done to the Vice crew. The next episode is going to be covering Billy Jack Haynes. And if you want to know the story about Billy Jack Haynes, I mean, he's not all there. I mean, like, he's definitely Cocoa for Cocoa Puffs. Like, there's definitely a few screws loose. So anyways, that's my video on the hot stuff Eddie Gilbert. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and don't forget to also check out Ringside Rants podcast. We're live at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern time on Thursdays, and we're also going to be going live this Monday, live reacting to Monday Night Raw. Have a good day, everybody, and remember, if you're not down with that, we got 2 words for you. Acknowledge us.